Good morning, everybody. Uh, it's Saturday morning. As you can tell, I got a haircut. It was getting a little hard to comb. When it gets long, it just kind of sticks out everywhere. Uh, Not that I minded it when I was younger. I don't even mind it that much now. It's just harder to mess with. I like it short. Um, we start the revival at Victory Baptist Church tomorrow. Jim Collins will be preaching. I'm going to be leading music, and I've invited all kinds of people to come and play and sing, and I hope they all do. We should have lots of music. It'll be beginning tomorrow night. Well, actually, we're beginning in the morning at 10, but nightly, Sunday through Friday, all this week, starting tomorrow at 6:30. We'll be having lots of fun and lots of fun. So help me, Bob. Because Bob Long, my friend, is going to come. He used to be the pastor of that church. He's going to be there with me singing with Miss Tina and Charlene. We're going to pretend like we're 30 years ago doing the old quartet. It'll be fun. Well, I know it'll be fun. I don't know how good it'll be, but it ought to be interesting. We finished up the church at Ephesus tomorrow. Yes, we finished it up tomorrow. We finished up the church at Ephesus yesterday in chapter 2 of Revelation. Remember what we're doing here. Jesus told John to write the things which thou hast seen, the things which are, the things which shall be hereafter. He's instructed him to write letters that Jesus is dictating to John, to the church at Ephesus, Smyrna, Pergamos, Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, and Laodicea, these 7 churches. There were 7 literal churches in Asia Minor, which was southern Turkey and northern Syria at that time, with Thyatira being up close to what was originally the Turkey part of the Turkey that became Turkey. Uh, what was it? Anatolia was what they called it. But to put all these places where they are on the map now, none of these churches exist. Some of the ruins exist, of course. Many of the ruins exist, many of the antiquities, but they're no longer cities, so to speak, and there are no longer churches there. They formed a horseshoe from the coast at Ephesus around to a mail route. The Roman road went around on the mail route. And because of the Parthian Empire, this area would become very important as the Parthians tried to spread their influence into the central Middle East. And so the Romans had money, they had population, they had garrisons there in those mail towns on their foothold where they were going to hold their empire together. 100 years later, they did try to invade what used to be Babylon and Persia, but the Parthian Empire had taken over, and they were never able to hold Babylon, although they visited it and fought some battles in what was ancient Mesopotamia. They could not hold that area, so they withdrew. They would eventually withdraw to this horseshoe 100 years, 150 years after the time of John the Apostle. So there's a lot of history there. We finished up with Ephesus. We know that Paul was the impetus, I guess, that started that church, but it looked like the real church building in the beginning was done by Priscilla and Aquila and Apollos. Then Paul returned and he found more disciples and brought some help from his team, from Timotheus or some of the guys, Aristarchus, the guys that were helping him in Macedonia. Brought them in with him, and they worked for 2 years to where that everybody in Asia heard the word of God. And he stayed in that house, the school of one Tyrannus, so that all Asia heard the gospel during those +2 years, 2 years and some months. And there was a great revival and a great evangelistic outreach too, a great winning of souls, a great church built at Ephesus, of which we believe that Timothy and Apollos and the Apostle John were all pastors at one time or another. Now, Jesus is dictating these letters to John, the apostle, anywhere from 27 to 30 years after Paul has been killed by Nero. John is the last apostle. We know that Paul started the church at Ephesus with Priscilla and Aquila and those others I told you about, and it was a great work. Good morning, Rhonda. God bless you, my dear sister. And so we know it was a great work. The question comes up is, did Paul establish the church at Smyrna, which was the next stop on the mail route? All of these, in this horseshoe on this mail route, all of these 7 churches are about 30 miles apart. And that's how far you could walk in a day. That's how far you could ride a horse in a day. And so, by wagon, 2 days. But a fast horse carrying the mail, make 30 miles a day easy. If you've ever noticed that a lot of the towns out west, they're sometimes 90 miles apart or 80 miles apart because you couldn't build a town where you didn't have water. But before you get to the Rockies, as you're going across the United States, you'll notice that even today, these towns of any size are like 30 miles apart. Why are they 30 miles apart? Because that's how far you could ride in a day on horseback. I have a theory that sometimes people just went till they came to the next watering hole and they were tired of riding, so there's their town. Well, it was the same back then. They're about 30 miles apart. So whether Paul actually started, but what I believe that the church at Smyrna may have been visited by Paul, may have been, but I believe that some of his students there in the school of one Tyrannus, I believe that they went up there. And I also believe that that John the Apostle either preached there a lot or he went up there after he got out of Patmos, and instead of returning to Ephesus, he went up to Smyrna and maybe ministered there because he had a disciple named Polycarp, and you can look him up. He's Polycarp of Smyrna. About 60 years after John wrote the Revelation, the Romans killed Polycarp, burned him at the stake because he refused to worship the emperor. And what Polycarp said famously when they asked him to deny Christ, he said, "I have served him 86 years, and he's never done me any wrong." Did that mean that Polycarp was 86 years old when he got burned at the stake, or does it mean that he got saved as a young man and then for 86 years since he got saved, he'd been serving Christ? I don't know. But he was a disciple of John the Apostle, or so he claims. I believe it. I don't see any reason not to believe it because it seems right. The reason it seems right is because just as Paul taught Timothy, then the people who came after Paul would have taught people too. And John, the apostle whom Jesus loved, I'm sure he was teaching people all the time. As a matter of fact, if we can believe the account, the reason beyond what the Romans were getting Polycarp for in Smyrna, refusing to worship the emperor, to burn incense to the emperor, because Smyrna was a center of emperor worship. The Roman emperor proclaimed himself to be God. Good morning, Chris. Good morning, Julie. And so there was another reason that they got Polycarp, because what he did, he had the Gospel of John, and he may have had Revelation, may have had all of John's books, because he was John's disciple. And Polycarp is a big reason why the Gospel of John, the 3 letters of John, and the revelation of Jesus Christ, why they're so far spread by the time that the churches become more organized and all the churches are using the Gospel of John, is because Polycarp made his life as a disciple of John. He kept copying and writing John's books and sending them off by carriers to other churches and other towns. So that's that's my theory, based on history, secular history, granted, of why and how John influenced beyond Ephesus, that he influenced Smyrna, because he had a disciple there at Smyrna that lost his life and was a great manuscript copyist and publisher of John's works. Remember, they didn't have a printing press. They had to copy everything by hand. So let's get into the church at Smyrna. Historically, it looks at persecution all the way from the days in Jerusalem, right after the crucifixion, all the way up to the 300s A.D., maybe 315. Certainly by the Edict of Milan, and I believe that was in 13. I believe that was in 313, and could have been 315. I think it was in 313, where Constantine, the emperor, made a proclamation that Christianity wasn't outlawed anymore, and it more or less stopped the persecutions. There were many persecutions. John was suffering the persecution under the Emperor Domitian when that emperor put John on Patmos, that penal colony, where he worked in mines. They mined salt and lead and sulfur on that island. It was just like a rock sitting out there in the middle of the Aegean Sea. I'm sure it wasn't pleasant. Now let's get into the church at Smyrna. I've given you some background. 30 miles to the north by northeast of Ephesus. And under the angel, this begins in verse 8 of chapter 2 of Revelation. Who's it? Shirley. Yes, Shirley is with us. God bless you, sister. And unto the angel of the church in Smyrna write, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. Well, I wonder who that could be. That's Jesus. That is Jesus. He says, I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last, the beginning and the ending. That's how he introduces himself to John. He says, I am Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending, saith the Lord, which is and which was and which is to come, the Almighty. I am Alpha and Omega, the first and the last. I am he that liveth and was dead. Behold, I am alive forevermore, and have the keys of hell and death. Write the things which thou hast seen, and the things which are, and the things which shall be hereafter. So the church at Smyrna was an actual church with live, living people in it doing their thing. And when John wrote this letter, Polycarp may have been a disciple already. He would have been a much younger man, because 60 years later he gets martyred. And he had been serving Christ for 86 years. We already went into that. Did that mean he was 86 years old, or did it mean that he had gotten saved as a young man or as a boy and then served Christ 86 years. We don't know. But he was at Smyrna. Was he at Ephesus and then went to Smyrna? He's referred to in all the church history as Polycarp of Smyrna. So apparently he was Smyrnese. He was a Smyrnite. I don't know. Nobody knows. But if John had already installed him as pastor at the church at Smyrna, and it could be that that's who's getting this letter from John in 96 AD. Possible. But whoever was the pastor at the church at Smyrna got the letter, because Jesus said the 7 stars are the 7 angels of the churches, of the 7 churches. And the angels in that sense means messenger, and it also means pastor, because pastor is our messenger from God. He serves by the call and the will of God. And you can always tell when someone's not serving by the will of God. Their church looks weird and crazy and all kinds of stupid things are going on in it. Then you know that person was not called by God, and that the Holy Spirit has no sway over that church at all, where things are not done decently and in order. There are no exceptions. Now, when God calls a pastor, he calls a shepherd. The shepherd leads. He doesn't push. You know, it's a big fault among a lot of pastors today who think that they're all that in a bag of chips. Let me tell you something, Bubba. You will learn, if you haven't learned already, that you can pull a rope anywhere you want to go, but you can't push it very far. Now, you may be looking at us as a bunch of sheep, and we're the Lord's sheep. But he's also given us a spirit of discernment, and we can tell the real from the fake. And as was quoted in Jesus' Revolution, this is very, very true. Lies are loud. There are no exceptions. Lies are always loud. Whoever yells to be, who's ever got the biggest voice, lies are loud. The truth is usually quiet. I want you to remember that when we look at the humility of the people at Smyrna. The churches today, they need a big dose of humility. I see these guys on TV sometimes, on these big platforms. They they act like the world trembles when they walk on it, that God has picked them personally to decide for the rest of us. Well, I don't see that happening in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul wrote, "Follow me," twice. The first time he wrote it, he just said, "Follow me." But then in a later letter, it felt like he had to qualify that. And he said, "Follow me as I follow Christ." So, beloved, if you're following a man or a woman who is not following Christ, well, then you're not following Christ. Let's see, it's a qualifier. You can only believe me as I represent Christ. And as long, for a preacher to represent Christ to the people, to the sheep, and I'm just a sheep. I'm a sheep of the great shepherd, the chief shepherd, the good shepherd. David called him my shepherd. Can you call him my shepherd today? The Lord is my shepherd. If it's not your shepherd, you got trouble coming. Right here in River City, with a capital T, and that rhymes with P, and it stands for pool. Da, 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 da. Anyway, ask yourself the question, how humble is the man in the pulpit? How humble is your pastor? Does your pastor pray the way he's encouraging you to pray, if he encourages you at all? There's no life in Christ without prayer. How do you know somebody you don't talk to? Humility was very hard for me, because I was like some of these highfalutin preachers. You know, the ones that come on TV and tell all the rest of us that they decided what we need to do. They got it all figured out. Well, they're not humble. Jesus said, I'm meek and lowly. I serve a master, just like a slave. I'm a servant. He bought me with a price. I don't belong to myself. I belong to him. And he can do with or to me however he sees fit. I don't have a problem with that. I used to. But Jesus describes himself as a master. But this is how he describes himself. The one who gives us our work and sustains us in our very life and being. Shanna and Beth. I think Beth is watching from far away, because she's looking at flowers that don't grow in Houston, Texas. I don't think. I've never seen flowers like that in Houston. So she's got to be someplace else. But Beth loves a road trip. But Jesus, the master that I follow, we got to ask ourselves, the people that we follow, the people that we listen to, the people whom we choose to encourage us in our faith. Your priest, your missionary, your minister. If you're an Episcopalian, a priest. Or if you're just Brother Jimmy in common, earthy Southern Baptist language, which I'm not sure I'm a Southern Baptist anymore, but that's where I was ordained, and nobody's thrown me out yet. But let me just put it this way. They don't invite me to talk at any big meetings anymore, because I don't agree with a lot of the things that the denomination does. But how much are they like Jesus? And you say, well, if Jesus is my shepherd, Jesus is my leader, Jesus is my master, then how does he do that? Well, he describes it himself in Matthew, the Gospel according to St. Matthew, chapter 11, beginning verse 28. Jesus says, come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. When is the last preacher or priest or the right reverend whatever, which one of them did you feel like you were resting with? that offered to ease your burden. Nowadays, they either want to raise money for something that you don't agree with, or they want to build a new building. While people are dying and going to hell in the shadow of the steeple. Not only that, where people are starving in the shadow of the steeple. And people are cold and naked and homeless in the shadow of the steeple. And so, Brother Harris, we should concentrate on giving out the gospel, not on these social programs. Well, I believe in giving out the gospel too. There's nothing that says you can't do both. As a matter of fact, Jesus says the poor you have with you always, and when you can, you need to help them. That's an order. I care about a man's soul, but I care about his belly too, but I care about his soul first. Because if I feed a man and he dies, he just goes to hell with a full belly if he dies without Christ. So I do both. And I spent the last 20 plus years doing it, putting everything I had into it, which ain't a lot, believe me. But we do what we can. If I was a rich man, I'd be doing more. If I was poorer than I am, I might be doing less because I'd have less opportunity. The point is that you can't rest in the Lord or even with the Lord unless you're doing the work of the Lord. And he talks about working, but his work, it don't make you tired. It doesn't hurt you. His work is good. Look at what he says. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Boy, he sure does too. He gives me rest for me. When my sin comes up before my eyes, he says, okay, you did that. I know you did that. You know you did that too, but I forgave you for that a long time ago, so quit thinking about it. And that is the comfort, that is the rest, knowing that I'm forgiven. Knowing that his blood shed on Calvary bought me out of hell. And I don't have to worry about that anymore. And I'm not afraid to die. Can't really live as long as you're afraid of dying. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you. Well, I need to take his yoke upon me because I'm his servant, right? I belong to him. But look what he says. Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart. Next time you see one of these blowhards on TV, whether they're a politician or a preacher or whatever, whatever they claim to be, then you look at them and you question, well, is that guy meek and lowly at heart? I don't think so. He seems to think a lot of himself, doesn't he? Take my yoke upon you and learn of me, for I am meek and lowly in heart, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. That would have been how Polycarp was, because he says, 86 years have I served him, and he's never done me any wrong. How can I deny him now? And they burned him at the stake because he would not renounce Christ. Around 150 AD in Smyrna, the town we're talking about. So was he the messenger at the church of Smyrna in 96 AD? Maybe, probably not. Maybe John was still working for him. Maybe John found Polycarp after he got out of Patmos and went back to Ephesus. We just don't know. We do know this, that Polycarp was John's disciple, and he was the last living connection to the apostolic age. The Polycarp was the last living connection when he died to the apostles. Direct connection. Just like Timothy and Titus were Paul's disciples. Just like Mark had been a disciple of Paul and Barnabas and wound up a disciple of Peter. Wound up writing John Mark writing the Gospel of Mark. They killed him down in Egypt, in Alexandria. He was preaching Christ, and a crowd, some horses and carts, they got after him, and they crushed him to death in the street because he preached Jesus. Unto the angel of the church of Smyrna write, who could or may not have been Polycarp, we don't know. The things which saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive. Again, in characteristic, this is the persecuted church from the days right after the death, burial, and resurrection of Christ in Judea, up to the reign of Constantine and the Edict of Milan, which I believe is 313. It could be 315. Shoot me if I'm wrong. We'll look it up when we get done. But when Constantine ruled, he made that order not to persecute Christians anymore. Whether that was good or bad, I don't know. I know the church was doing pretty good as long as they were killing us because we had to stick together and we had to hold onto Jesus. Jesus says to the church of Smyrna, he says, these things saith the first and the last, which was dead and is alive, and that's Jesus. He says, I was alive, as I was dead, as I was alive, and I was dead, and behold, I'm alive forevermore, and hold the keys of hell and death. I'm Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the ending. I know thy works, Jesus says to Smyrna. I know thy works. And tribulation and poverty. I know what's going on with you. I know how hard you're working to serve me. I know thy works and tribulation and poverty. But thou art rich, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are the synagogue of Satan. Been a lot of ink spilled over that, and it's anti-Semitism, and it's not to be tolerated. I'll explain what it means. If I don't get it all explained today, I will continue tomorrow, because we'll be in just like with Ephesus, we were there for a week, and we'll be here for a week or more in the church of Smyrna. I know thy works. And tribulation and poverty. But thou art rich. Good morning, Jennifer. God bless you. And why are they rich? Because they're serving Christ. You see, I'm a poor man. But I've been able to preach to small and great, to poor and rich, because I belong to Christ. I have been able to stay alive and function with no real means of income, but God keeps sustaining us. I mean, all we have is our Social Security. But people are always wanting to buy my dinner. People always wanting to put gas in my car. People wanting to give me a car so that I will keep going. That is the work of God. God has made me rich in understanding. He's given me rich in opportunity to give out the gospel. That's why I'm afraid not to take any invitation. Some of you know that I'm going to Angola, the Louisiana State Penitentiary. It's a deal to check off my bucket list. I'm going to get to preach to the prisoners in the biggest maximum security prison in the country. And also, I am going to get to minister to the men on death row. I don't know how many there are. I've never been on death row. So it'll be something that I'll get to know. But see, I never would have got to do that if God hadn't opened that opportunity. A guy that was going happened to mention that he was working with me. And the guy who was heading up the team, he says, "You mean the fiddle player?" And my friend said, "Yeah." And then the guy in charge said, "Ask him to come with us." So on something in June, the last week of June, it's May now. Let's see. Let's see. On the 25th of June, we'll leave here, and Thursday will be a travel day. We'll be all day Friday and Saturday in the different sections on that large campus. I think it's huge. It's like 18,000 acres. And then on Sunday morning we will preach. I think more than once we'll preach in the chapel and whatever other chapels they have to all the people there, and then come back either Sunday afternoon or we'll sleep and come back Monday morning. I don't know. God made all that happen. It just came out of the blue. It's not going to cost me a penny. I'm riding with somebody that's going. I might have to buy my dinner a couple of times, but I'd have to eat anyway. And then when we get there, they take care of us down there. They got a place for us to stay right there on the campus. We don't have to go back and forth. And once we're in prison, we'll be in prison. We'll be there until we leave. I had some jokester friends that said, "Well, aren't you worried that they might keep you?" And I said, "Well, if they ain't caught me by now, they got nothing to hold me on. I did all of my felonies before there was the internet." I'm just grateful that when they ask you on a job application, it says, "Have you ever been convicted of a felony?" I can always say, "Yeah." And I've never been convicted of a felony. I'm just glad the question doesn't say, "Have you ever committed a felony?" I know thy works in tribulation and poverty, but thou art rich. See, whether you have any money or not, if God calls you to work, he'll provide the money. He ain't broke. You don't even have to ask anybody for it. Did you know that? If God's in it, God will instruct some other man or woman or couple. It usually happens from couples because, the people who are well off, they've been married they've had steady lives, been married for 40 years, and they've got assets, Those are the main people that support our missionaries and things like that, and little works like mine. And God will put it in that person's heart to help me out or to help somebody like me out. And they'll just contact me and say, "Hey, we want to help you do this. What can we do?" And then I just tell them, "This is what you do. We need money in a food pantry over here. We need money and clothes over here. We need travel money for this bunch." Oh, I can come up with all kinds of uses for the money that people want to give. But see, it's really God doing the giving. He's using those people who believe in his word. They're using those people to carry out the work. So it doesn't matter how poor you are. If you're following Christ, there will be the funds available for you to do the work. It's have to be faithful. You have to be where he wants you to be. You have to be doing what he wants you to do. And then he will supply both the funding and the function. He'll have the game plan. He'll do everything. For background reading, just, think about this. Think about how Moses built the tabernacle. God gave him the tabernacle and it had all this gold and silver and bronze and all this stuff that's supposed to go into it. And all of these materials, the beaver skins, the purple, the cloth, the scarlet, and the blue and the white, and all this stuff that they had to come up with. And then people had to make it. Well, he put knowledge in Bezalel and Aholiab, and they taught other people what to do, and they built the temple. But they didn't have anything to build it with, so they asked for donations of free will, and everybody who wanted to help build the temple to come. And then they brought so much stuff that the people who were doing the work, they said, hey, quit. We got too much. Tell them to quit giving. And so Moses had to tell them, don't bring any more. We got more than plenty. I've been in church work for a long time, and I've never been in a situation where people gave too much. That must be something else. It's sure. You've always got a 10-pound sack with 3 pounds worth of stuff in it. But you're trying to fill that sack. Just the opposite of the thing when you're too busy. Jesus knows our condition. And as long as we walk in Christ, we're not poor. We may not have material things, but we're not poor. I got a new t-shirt. It's everything's the GOAT. It says God over all things. Velda got me this t-shirt. I don't know why, but she did. And it came in the mail, and I'm wearing it. So there you go. That's how it works, beloved. I know thy works, Jesus said, in tribulation and poverty. I know you're working for me, and I know they're hassling you because of it. Your tribulation, your trials, persecution. Smyrna is the persecuted church, the great persecutions. And it's representative of all the persecutions from about 30 AD until 313 AD. And I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not. They're just saying that they're Jews. Now, John was a Jew. He was a follower of John the Baptist. He followed Jesus after John the Baptist. After John the Baptist said, behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. And he pointed at Jesus. From that day, or actually the day after, when Jesus came back to the Jordan, and John said, behold, the Lamb of God, which taketh away the sin of the world. And John and Andrew, Peter's brother, they stopped following John the Baptist that day and went to follow Jesus. You can read that account in chapter 1 of the Gospel according to John. He wrote it down. John was a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. They were all Jews. When he was being punished on the island of Patmos, he was a Jew. Now, why am I saying this if he's a Christian? Well, he's still a Jew. The church began as a sect of Judaism. If they would have received Christ, we would have all been the same. But they did not. They rejected Christ as king. He came and presented himself to the nation, but the rulers and the chief priests, I'm not talking about the everyday people. I'm talking about the people who ran things and spent all the money, all the corrupt people, just like today. They had a ruling class then, we got a ruling class now. And they decide everything and try to make you think it's your idea. But they persecuted Christians, the Jews did, the religious Jews, the controlling religious the temple class, the ruling class. They punished Christians because they were afraid of the Romans, and they had every right to be, because the Romans didn't put up with a lot of unrest. And they were also afraid that they would lose their place and that the Romans would take over and that they wouldn't be powerful anymore, the Jews, the ruling class in Judea. Well, they rejected Jesus as their king. When he rode in on Palm Sunday, they said, "Hosanna in the highest to the Son of David." And then less than a week later, they said, "Crucify him, crucify him." So the same crowd who called him king said, "Crucify him," 5 days later. I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. And I will tell you exactly what this means 60 years later, after the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ. When John writes the Revelation in 96 AD, and he's writing this particular part to Smyrna that's being persecuted. Smyrna, good morning, Kevin, was the center of emperor worship in Asia Minor. They had temples there. They had great temples. They had temple prostitutes. It was a big deal. You had to take the pledge to the emperor to get along. Well, although the church began as a sect of the Jews, and they were all Jews, the first Christians say the first 20,000 people in Jerusalem to join the church, they were all Jews. But as it spread out over the Roman Empire, and certainly this far to the north in modern-day Turkey and Smyrna, where there was an emperor worship, they were a very Gentile church, although some Jews did convert and become Christians. But they didn't have the Jewish tradition that they had in Judea or even in Babylon, because these were Gentile cities. They were pagan cities. They were Greek cities before they were Roman cities, and they had their gods. And now they worshiped Caesar, the emperor, who at the time that John wrote this letter was Domitian. Although Domitian would die, I think he was murdered or assassinated in 96 or 97 AD, just shortly after John writes this book. To the Romans, it didn't matter whether you were a Jew or a Christian, because devout Jews would not worship the emperor because they only had one God. Whether they were Christian or not, they were not going to worship the emperor. They would not burn incense to the emperor, to Domitian. But at the same time that they hated the Romans, they hated Christians too, because all they could see was that it was a blasphemy and a perversion against Judaism, instead of what it actually is a fulfillment of Judaism in the Messiah, the Son of David, to sit on a Jewish throne over a Jewish land. That was the promise of the Old Testament. That was the promise of the prophets, the promise of the coming kingdom. So you have a dynamic where the Romans are looking at Jews and Christians alike And the Jews hated the Christians there because they thought that they were blaspheming God. They also hated and feared the Romans, and they wanted to stay in business. So many Jews in the synagogue, many Jews in Smyrna, and there's a record of it. Now look up Judaism in ancient Turkey. Look up specifically Judaism in Smyrna and in Pergamos. No, Smyrna and Thyatira, where they had another large synagogue. So what many powerful, rich, landed, religious Jews did during that time is that they would burn incense to Caesar so that they would be left alone. They would tell themselves, hey, I'm not really worshiping Caesar. I'm just dropping this little bit of incense in the fire before Caesar's visage, his icon, his image. The image of the beast. They burned incense to him, and then they went on about their business and played like it didn't matter. But when you bow to any god besides the God of glory, you're worshiping an idol, and you're breaking the law, and you are in active sin against God. So because of the fear they had of the Romans, and because many of them were just pretending to worship Caesar and burn the incense so that they didn't get put out of business or killed, to deflect attention off of themselves, there were many Jews in that community, along with all kinds of other people, who would complain to the Romans and say, hey, we got a sect of our people over here. They claim to believe in the same God we do through one Jesus, but they won't worship Caesar. And if you don't burn incense to Caesar, you're going against the law, and you can be punished by death. And so those were the Jews of the synagogue of Satan, the ones who were collaborating. And it wasn't a large number, friends. You can do. I bet it wasn't more than 2 or 3%. But you got a growing church in Smyrna, a strong church in Smyrna, with martyrs willing to die rather than burn incense to Caesar. And then you got some religious, political people who happen to be Jews, who don't care anything about their own religion, but burn incense to Caesar so they can roll along and get along with the powers that be. And if they turn in these Christians, they haven't heard anything. That just gains them points with the Romans that they serve, and the Romans who are making them rich. And all they had to do was burn a little incense, see. And that is exactly to whom John is referring, a very small percentage of what I would say Jews who didn't care, who didn't think it mattered whether they worshiped another God, so long as they could gain place and wealth in this world. That's what John means when he says, I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. What he's saying is that when they burn incense to the emperor, they might as well be worshiping the devil, because they have made themselves an idol. That's no different than sacrificing their children to Molech, or to worshiping the Ashtaroths, or worshiping Baal. I am the Lord thy God. Thou shalt have no other gods before me. Thou shalt not make unto thee any graven image of anything that is heaven, or that is in the earth, or that is under the earth, or in the sea, or under the sea. Burning incense by a small percentage of nominal Jews who betrayed both their people and their God. so that they could gain favor with the Romans. That's who John is talking about when he says, I know thy works and thy tribulation and thy poverty, and I know the blasphemy of them which say they are Jews and are not, but are of the synagogue of Satan. Because that's who empowered them. That's who propelled them. That's who possessed them to betray their God and to point out otherwise innocent people to be martyred by Roman justice because they refused to worship Caesar. I got to tell you, we got way too many Christians worshiping Caesar today. You need to quit it. Your hope is in Jesus Christ, not in a government, not in a president, not in a governor, or in a pop star or a country singer or a movie star. Your hope is in Jesus Christ and Him only. My hope is built on nothing less than Jesus' blood and righteousness. That's the way it's got to be. When He shall come with trumpet sound, oh, may I then in Him be found, dressed in His righteousness alone, faultless to stand before the throne. My friend, if you can't stand naked before Christ and dressed only in His righteousness, with which He clothes you, you'll never stand before Him except to be condemned to hell. Follow Christ today. Nothing in this world is more important than your relationship with Christ. Nothing. Nobody. Make sure your union with Christ is sure. Believe on the Lord Jesus Christ, and thou shalt be saved. God bless you. Go to church tomorrow.